1. Good day, everyone. Welcome to the Corporate Services Committee meeting held today. We have a number of delegations, but we do have 3 reports, and we'll start off with Director Service Area Report.
Thank you, Chair O'Toole. So a few highlights from corporate services. The finance team, procurement team, and as well as human resources and IT are continuing to work together on the ERP implementation. So right now they're in user acceptance testing, which is the final stage of testing, and providing in-person training to numerous staff across the organization. The financial services team is also working on the 2023 budget. Deliberations will be held in mid-November. GIS has released the new 2022 Ortho Photos. So the GIS team does this every 4 years in collaboration with the county. So these are high-resolution color images of the city and the immediate surrounding area. And it is able to capture elevation models as well as categorize ground features such as water bodies, paths, and vegetation. It can be accessed on the city's website. Comms and marketing are the Our Downtown book that documents the downtown rehabilitation project is hot off the press and has been distributed to many of the downtown businesses impacted by construction. The book is also available to view or purchase at the Grande Prairie Museum. Access GP call volumes have increased around Experience GP and other noteworthy events. It seems that citizens are very excited about events and making lots of inquiries. And finally, Legislative Services is continuing with by-election activities in preparation for the October 17th election day. There is a need for more election workers, and communication staff is assisting on increasing marketing efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just ask if anyone on committee or council has any questions. Councillor Thiessen, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Chair O'Toole. Just a curiosity more than anything, if we're short on election workers on the time of election day, what's the standard for standing elected officials helping out with at the poll stations?
Thank you, Chair O'Toole. I don't have the answer to that. It's something that we'd have to get back and let you know.
All right. I see no other questions, so I'll just go back to where I started. Gladys Blackmore is not here today. She'll be on Zoom. I am chairing the meeting, Kevin O'Toole. We have Dylan Bressy and Mayor Clayton is also on Zoom. So we'll start off again with the resident satisfaction survey. And Mr. Tarrant, would you like to speak with that, please?
Thank you, Chair O'Toole. In June and July of this year, a resident satisfaction survey was completed by Deloitte, who was our provider of the survey. The survey looked at residents' views on a variety of topics, ranging from satisfaction with the city itself and with city services and with knowing where the economy is going, as well as drilling in on some of the different pieces of the of different services and where their satisfaction levels are at with those. Overall, city residents are very positive about the city and about the direction things are going. A few stats from the survey: 89% believe that Grande Prairie is a vibrant and healthy local economy, which was a 9-point increase from our last survey in 2020. Something else that was also significant, while there's definitely room for improvement on crime. Crime did move from the top issue in 2020 to the 4th in the most recent survey. And we saw it was one of the largest increases in satisfaction. Now 62% of respondents indicated they feel safe and secure, which was an 11-point increase from 2020. So while there's definitely room for improvement there, that was one of the greatest areas of improvement noted. In terms of city services, we have about 73% of respondents indicated that the quality of service that they receive from the city is consistently high, which was also an increase from the previous survey. With us today, we have Simon Webb, who is with Deloitte, who's going to walk through the survey results in a little bit more detail. And do we have him on the line there? Yeah, perfect. I will turn it over to Simon, who will give a bit of introduction and go for a little bit more of a deeper analysis.
Hi, everybody. Hope you can see the screen there that I'm sharing.
Yeah, it looks good.
Perfect. So hi, thanks for that introduction, Rory. My name's Simon Webb, and I'm a senior associate at Deloitte. I'll be walking you through the City of Grande Prairie resident satisfaction findings for 2022. So the objective of the survey was, as Rory mentioned, to objectively measure satisfaction with municipal services and prioritize issues. It's to build upon metrics that we asked in previous years and to continuously improve municipal service delivery and inform service program design. It's also to guide future actions and decisions for the City of Grande Prairie and to enhance budgetary planning and decision processes. And a big responsibility for my team was to make sure that we undertake a statistically representative data collection method to obtain accurate, relevant feedback from residents. So the project started in May of this year. We had a project kickoff meeting, and then we went right into revisiting the questionnaire. We wanted to make sure that all of the questions in the questionnaire were as relevant as possible this year. We wanted, wherever possible, to be able to monitor trends over time and also to make improvements on some metrics so that we can benchmark looking forward. After that, we went to data collection and analysis and reporting. So the survey, the main portion of the survey was conducted using a computer-aided telephone interviewing system. So what this is live interviewers who are at a computer. They are randomly assigned numbers to call from the city using a mix of landline and cell phone numbers, and they enter the data directly into the data set. The numbers were called from June to July in 2022 in the evenings on weekdays and all day on Saturdays. The reason that the sort of random dialing portion is important is because you want to make sure that everybody in the population has an equal likelihood of being selected for the survey, and that's what gets you a representative population of the survey of the population. What we got was a total of 401 completed interviews, which leads to a maximum margin of error of plus or minus 4.9%. What that means is that we can say with 95% confidence that all of our metrics are within roughly 4.9% of the true underlying metric. In the vast majority of cases, it's much, much closer than that. To take it a step further, we also weight the results by the population age and gender according to the most recent census for the City of Grande Prairie. Just as an extra step to make sure that the results accurately represent the population of the city. Wherever possible in the report, we benchmarked against the previous survey, which was in 2020. Now, it's important to note that that survey was conducted right before the first wave of the COVID pandemic. Despite that, many of the KPIs actually remained quite stable. There were some increases in dissatisfaction levels, but there's also quite a few improvements. So a lot of successes there. A key takeaway for us, though, is there was a lot of successes and a lot to celebrate within the survey. It's clear that residents were proud to call Grande Prairie home. They highly rated the strong economic climate, strong sense of security, high levels of satisfaction with municipal services and city staff, and they were a highly engaged community. One of the first questions we asked, we got respondents to list what was the most important issue in their mind to the city. This was an open-ended question, and some of the key themes that came out were improvements to roads, taxes, homelessness, and the crime rate. And if you look in the blue box to the right there, you see in 2020 what the most mentioned topics were. You can see crime rate used to be the top issue and has moved down the list, like Rory mentioned in the introduction. Homelessness and roads are still top issues, but roads has sort of moved up in the priority, and taxes is a new priority. This is one of our first key performance indicators that we looked at. We asked respondents, how would you rate the overall quality of life in the city of Grande Prairie? And 70% had mentioned that it was good or very good. Now, it's worth mentioning here, we did make the decision to change the scale of this metric this year. In the previous years, it was very poor, poor, good, and very good. But we wanted to allow for a bit more granularity, sort of in that midsection. As a resident, if you're rating the place you live as the quality of life is poor, it's sort of a fairly extreme answer. This will allow, looking forward, for this metric to be a lot more receptive to improvements. So it'll be a good benchmark looking forward. Just this year, we can't compare it to the previous metrics exactly. We also asked how residents felt that the quality of life had changed over the past 3 years. Not extremely surprisingly, given the pandemic years that we had, there was a higher percentage of residents who felt that the quality of life had worsened compared to improved over the past 3 years. But if you compare this to the 2020 survey, it's actually not a whole lot different. There's actually some signs of this improving, with less people saying that the quality of life had worsened and slightly more saying that the quality of life had increased. So roughly in line there, and that's a success in our mind, given the few years that we've had. This question, we asked, how likely would you be to recommend the city of Grande Prairie as a place to live to a friend or colleague? We use this metric to make what's called a net promoter score. So it's a 10-point scale. If respondent mentioned that this was 6 or less, we call those potential detractors of the community. So if somebody asked them, they might express a potentially negative opinion. We call active promoters as individuals who rated this scale 9 or above, and then neutral or passive individuals at the 7 or 8. And what the net promoter score is it's basically the promoters minus the detractors. So in net, how many promoters do you have above detractors? We did see a slight trend towards the negative side, with negative 25% there, suggesting some more detractors than promoters. But if you look in the blue box, this was actually an improvement from 2020 and a statistically significant improvement. So you're trending absolutely in the right direction. And I think that's a positive from our mind. This was one of a really positive slide. And across all these metrics, definitely some successes here. There was a high level of agreement with statements, particularly like the city of Grande Prairie is a community with a bright future and with a vibrant and healthy economy. And both of those were notable improvements from 2020. Even these lower ones were still they're very successful metrics. Like, I'm proud to live in the city of Grande Prairie, 85% there. A great community to raise a family, and a place where residents feel safe and secure, and lots of improvements from 2020 on these metrics. So definitely some stuff to celebrate there. This was a new metric that we added this year. And at Deloitte, this is a KPI that we measure across all of our resident satisfaction surveys, and one that we recommend you focus on continually trying to improve over time. It's a great KPI. And what we got was 73% satisfaction rate with overall services provided by the city of Grande Prairie. So that's a solid result. Definitely a bit of room to build upon in future years, but a great benchmark to have there. Now, we do ask that metric across all of the municipalities, so we do resident satisfaction surveys. Like I mentioned, some of the municipalities use different scales. So for this metric to compare to other communities, we put it on a scale of -10 to +10. You can see there the municipal norm is averaging at +4.2 on that scale. The city of Grande Prairie was slightly below that. I don't believe that would be a statistically significant difference, so trending a bit below the average, but pretty close to the average there. Some room to build on for sure, but nothing to panic on there at all. We also asked the satisfaction on specific municipal services, and some of the ones that got extremely high satisfaction rates were the fire department, parks, playgrounds, and trails, arts, culture, facilities, and programs. Some of the ones with a bit more room for improvement were city-operated roads and infrastructure, like we heard in that first slide, snow and ice removal, and housing and rent supports. Now, we take these services and we create a metric which we find cities tend to find extremely useful, and that's called Derived Importance. So without getting into the weeds of the statistics on this one, it's a way of showing which services are going to drive improvements in the overall satisfaction. So this animated fictional example here, you can see that as satisfaction with road maintenance and repair goes up and down in satisfaction, it has a very large increase or impact on overall satisfaction. As you do the same thing to availability of trails, which is another potential service, not as big of an impact on overall satisfaction. So in that example, road maintenance and repair would be, it would have a high level of importance. And that's one that we would recommend focusing on because that's going to create bigger improvements in that KPI looking forward. We use that importance measure to in our priority matrix, where we make priorities for the city based on services that have a high level of importance and also some room for improvement in satisfaction scores. So if there's room to make improvements and it's going to have a big impact, those are the ones we recommend focusing on most. This graph here shows just the importance scores. So in the city of Grande Prairie, some of the most important services to citizens were, or residents were support services for families, local policing, parks, playgrounds, and trails, and housing and rent supports. And there were some changes from 2020 where the most important service was city-operated recreation facilities and city-operated roads and infrastructure. Support services for families still staying quite important, though.
Simon was us.
Oh.
Simon, I was wondering if you wanted to take questions now or at the end of your presentation.
Perhaps if we could save them to the end of the presentation, and I'm happy to go back to slides if people want to write down the questions.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. So this is the priority matrix that I talked about. Here you can see our top priorities from this analysis were city-operated roads and infrastructure, snow and ice removal, housing and rent supports, and support services for families. So again here, the services that rise to the top are ones with room for improvement. So that performance column is how satisfied people were with that service. So if there's low satisfaction, there's room for improvement in that score. And it's a balance between room for improvement and high importance. Now, this isn't a prescriptive list. Like, we're not saying do number 1 before number 2 before number 3. It just helps to sort of stratify the order of which of these factors is probably going to be helpful to focus on and help improve your KPI looking forward and help improve satisfaction. So I'll touch on a few points on these next few slides without taking up too much time. You will have the full report to look at your leisure. But for this one, we did notice a decrease in the use of the Eastlink Center compared to the 2020 survey. This was a fairly noticeable decrease as well. Among those that had indicated they had recently visited the facility, there was predominantly a positive view of the quality of the facility. Some room to build upon there, though, for sure. 36% of residents had reached out or contacted the City of Grande Prairie in the past 12 months. The methods that they primarily used were telephone and email. Among those who had contacted the City of Grande Prairie in the past 12 months, there was predominantly positive sentiment about how satisfied they were with the recent contact. This had gone down noticeably since 2020, again, based on the few years that we've had and probably the types of interactions that they might have had over the past few years. It's not terribly surprising, but something to note there for sure. We noticed that residents of Grande Prairie were really engaged. It's a high metric on the top statistic there. I would like to provide feedback to the City of Grande Prairie for the purpose of influencing decision-making about city projects. 75% is quite high for that metric, and it shows a highly engaged community. It did come down 7 percentage points from 2020, but still we would consider that a highly engaged community, which was interesting because for this next metric, we looked at, it looked like most residents had not involved themselves in municipal engagement or city-led public participation processes within the last year, only 11% saying yes. So a bit of a disconnect between how engaged residents seem to want to be and how much engagement there was, or how much they're engaging. When they're asked about the top 3 sources of receiving information from the City of Grande Prairie, news outlets, Facebook, and city websites were the top 3, and those were the same 3 in 2020. We ran some tax scenarios by residents. They were given the option in the future if they would prefer to increase taxes above the rate of inflation to improve service levels, to increase taxes by the rate of inflation to maintain service levels at the current level, to keep taxes at the current level and reduce existing service levels, or to decrease taxes below current levels by significantly reducing existing service levels. So the most chosen option here was keep taxes at the current level and reduce existing service levels. Worth noting, though, that 39% of the respondents were open to some type of tax increase, whether it's just at the rate of inflation or above. And a few more slides here about the local economy. There was quite positive perceptions about various aspects of the local economy. Like 85% of respondents indicated they felt growth within the city would positively impact the quality of life in the city. 71% noted that the city does a good job of balancing and managing this growth and development. And looking ahead 12 years from now, over half of the respondents expected the economy in the city of Grande Prairie to improve, and only 15% expected that to weaken. In terms of how they rate the strength of the local economy, 48% rating that as very good in the city of Grande Prairie, and that's actually above how they rated the strength of the local economy in Alberta, which was 38% very good or excellent. So those are all the slides I have now. There are more slides in the full report that you're welcome to look through. And now I'll open it up to questions. I'm happy to clarify anything or take any questions about anything I've mentioned.
Sure, I have Gladys Blackmore that would like to ask a question. She's the chair of this committee.
Thank you, Councillor O'Toole, for first of all chairing this meeting for me and for taking my question. So my question's a little bit complicated, so I hope I can figure out how to ask you this. But if you go to the slide that says core service and program importance, I noticed that city-operated roads and infrastructure are ranked at number 5. And yet roads and infrastructure were ranked as the highest percentage of dissatisfaction at 28%. So I'm assuming that the ranking comes from a slightly different question, but I'm wondering, does that really mean that people will react most positively to support services for families, or are they going to be more engaged if they see improvements in roads and snow removal, for example?
Right, and maybe to explain how we come up with this measure a little bit better, I'll use an analogy that our senior director uses quite a bit. And if you're looking at, for instance, bus ridership, so you want to increase bus ridership, and you ask somebody how important or how satisfied are you with each of these factors, what's going to come to the top is usually like safety, things that are sort of top of mind. People say, of course, that's important. But if you use a derived importance methodology, you're seeing what's actually driving their decision to use the bus. Things like price or accessibility, those things tend to actually improve bus ridership. Safety is maybe one of those criteria that you need the safety, but it's not necessarily one of those things that's going to improve your metric in a significant way over time if you invest a bunch more money in it. So that's what we do here. We actually derive the importance using a statistical measure, and what it shows is basically how much overall satisfaction is expected to improve if you make improvements in each of these. So city-operated roads and infrastructure is one of those top mentioned things in the open response, right? When we ask people what's the most important issue, city-operated roads and infrastructure is one of those top of mind issues. But here, if you look at things that are expected to improve that overall satisfaction, it looks like support services for families and local policing are some of those things that might come in a bit above city-operated roads and infrastructure. Now, there's not a huge difference in importance between those, so these are all really important issues, not to say they're not important, but just to explain a bit more how that's made.
If I could ask a follow-up question, Councillor O'Toole.
Yes, please.
I look at 28% of dissatisfaction with roads ranked at the very highest level of dissatisfaction as actually being quite low. It tells me that generally people are maybe even more satisfied than they relayed in their ranking of satisfaction. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Maybe they are more satisfied than they mentioned. Just to clarify, yeah. I mean, for city-operated roads and infrastructure, that is one that we do see people tend to rank a little bit lower. You know, you're not people might be positive about it if they see like really nice roads, but a lot of times when you think of roads and infrastructure, you're thinking of how many potholes you ran over that morning. So it is one of those sort of lower ranked scores, but I do think it does show that there is some room for improvement there, and if this is what citizens are sort of mentioning, it's coming to the top of their mind. Potentially something to look into there.
Thank you. Thanks, Kevin.
Hey, take your hand down on the screen there, too. There we go. All right, Dylan Bressy, your next counselor.
Great. Thank you, Chair O'Toole. And thank you, Mr. Webb, Mr. Tran, and whoever else put work into this. I always look forward to getting this. I think that having a truly random look at what our residents are thinking is very useful for our decision-making. So it's a highlight of my every 2 years, or one of my highlights. I'm curious, though, as much as I appreciate this a random one, I know we also had an online survey. Did we see significant differences between what people said at that self-selected online survey and at this more random survey?
Yeah, and so we did make a separate report for the online survey, and within that report, we look at some of the differences between the survey. What we typically find with those sort of self-selected types of surveys, you tend to see a lot more extreme answers, right? Because if people are self-selecting into those types of surveys, a lot of times, it's because they have something to say or to relay to the city. I don't know all the metrics off the top of my head here, but definitely being able to review that report, I think will answer a lot of your questions. Typically what we see is trending towards the more negative types of answers from an online format.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's definitely been my observation in the past. I guess this may be a question for Mr. Tarrant. Is that online survey, are those results going to be released as well?
Through the chair, we typically don't release those surveys because they are not statistically valid, and so they're not typically made available.
Is that something that council could perhaps see?
I think that's something we can make available, absolutely.
Great. No, I really appreciate that. I always think, especially when I was a new councillor, it was really instructive seeing that. I think that's just evidence that the online sentiment often isn't the real in the community sentiment. We often do get very different results when we do statistically different surveys. I get different results when I'm knocking on doors, and I think that's just useful to see where those differences are. 'Cause sometimes it feels like online is the real community sentiment, and I think this could evidence of where online is and isn't aligning. So I think that'd be great if council at least could see those online results.
Mr. Berg.
Thank you, Chair O'Toole. And again, thanks, Simon, and thanks, Rory, for putting this together. I love statistics, and so this is wonderful for a guy like me. And I'm glad you've got this slide up, because one of the things that I see, fire department, parks, and arts and culture all rated very high, yet they're low on the importance scale. So one of the things, more for context or wording, would it be fair to say that the importance satisfaction areas are not less important, but rather citizens are content with it and they're more raising the flags on other areas, and therefore it gets an importance designation or so I guess looking at this upside down, it would be more priorities versus importance, if that makes sense. I guess that's more of a point than a question, I guess. Any comment on that?
Yeah, I think you're right in your statement there. And, if everybody was very satisfied with the fire department, which is usually a bit less sort of variation on that one, you're not going to see a whole lot of variation with that overall satisfaction. So importance tends to be a bit naturally lower with sort of the high-performing services. Another way to look at this priority matrix, which I'll point out here, the services that have high performance and high importance, those can be considered the city's sort of strengths, like the key strengths. So if you're doing really well on something and that's very important to residents, so for example, here I see parks, playgrounds, and trails, 91% satisfaction and 8.3 importance. That would be, in my mind, a key strength of the city that is both very important to residents and the city performing quite well on. But definitely not to say that these aren't priorities. Keep building on those strengths in those high-performing services. But in terms of things that are going to move the KPI, this is sort of where those top priority rank services come in.
Perfect, thank you. And so then another follow-up question, kind of along the lines of Councillor Blackmore. So when we talk about measuring road satisfaction, where do we rank compared to other municipalities, particularly in the north?
That's a good question, and it's probably something I would have to take back to our team to look into a little bit. Off the top of my head, I would say you're probably fairly in line with what we've seen in the area. Like roads and infrastructure is one of those things that, like I said, so it tends to be a little bit more on the negative side. But I would say you're fairly well in line, and it's just something to consider that residents are thinking about those things, and when they're rating these scales, you know, that this is something that's coming to the top of their mind.
Great, thanks, Mr. Webb.
All right, Simon, I got some more questions for you here from the councillors. I'll start off with Councillor O'Connor.
Thank you, Chair O'Toole. Mr. Webb, thank you. Excellent presentation. I have a couple of questions just on the statistics, and I'm wondering if you could tell me how many calls you had to make to be able to come to the 401 number of respondents. And after that, do you identify your company, and do you identify who you're doing it for? And I'll explain the reason afterwards.
So to the first question, that is something that we can look up. I think on the first slide, I won't go all the way back to it, but we had a response rate of, I think, just under 9%. So that's after going through all the incorrect numbers and everything, how many people completed this survey. So we can say we can share after the fact how many calls we made, but yeah, I think we called through just about the whole directory that was available for landlines and the cell sample that we had. There was quite a few calls made on this one. And in terms of if we identify, yeah, so basically the introduction says, hi, my name is whatever the interviewer name is. I'm calling from Deloitte on behalf of the city of Grande Prairie. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, it does. And so what I'm kind of hearing is that, is it 4,000 or are you talking 35,000 people that you contacted? It sounds like the latter.
I think it would probably be in the range of 4,000. The response rate takes into account a few things, like I said, like wrong or block numbers or incorrect numbers and all that kind of stuff. But we did make, yeah, I would say definitely more than 4,000, and I can get that number over to Rory after the call.
And the reason I'd asked that, Mr. Webb, was I received a call on, and they wouldn't identify who it was for, so I hung up. And I'm just wondering if they won't identify who they're calling it for. I hate being rude, but I appreciate you identify the who and the what, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, all our interviewers were prepped with that introduction, so I'm hoping that wasn't had nothing to do with us, but yeah, thanks for letting us know.
Okay. I got Councillor Bosch.
Thank you, Chair O'Toole. My questions, thank you for this report, but my questions are a bit in line with Councillor O'Connor. The 401 interviews that you conducted, with the extrapolated results of those interviews, would you say that this is a clear picture of our community? 75 or 70,000 people and 400 interviews. How would you judge this survey?
Yeah, so we would say that it definitely is an accurate representation of the population, and it's sort of the way that we design it with that random selection methodology. Also going a step further to make sure that all the responses that they're weighted by age and gender, so that the responses accurately represent the full population. We've gone through this lots of times, and we've for example, expanded sample sizes. The results don't tend to change because once you reach a certain critical mass of people and you narrow your margin for error, the responses get very accurate. And at 400, the responses should be quite accurate. Just for context, like this is how, for example, polling companies are able to predict elections across the country with small sample sizes, like even like 400 or 500 people. If they sample representatively across a wide population, the results are quite accurate by design.
Okay, I'm happy to hear that. Overall, I think the majority of people now have cell phones. So if you're doing landlines, that in itself is, somewhat of a different demographic in my opinion. I don't know many people who have landlines anymore. A question for, you have roads, snow and ice, housing, and support families for family services. Do you identify what the supports are? So I can clearly see the top three and know what they mean, but support for family services, exactly what is that? So what supports are you speaking of, or are they speaking of?
Right. So this is the service that we presented to them. So the support services for families is what the resident had considered in terms of that. What we can do is look through some of the open-ended responses, for example, to help provide a bit of extra context to those services. I guess the general sentiment here is sort of overall when they look at the support services for families, this is what residents rated, but we can't really dive into more detail here based on that metric. But it is something that could be investigated further now that we have this statistic.
Yeah, I would appreciate that, because to me this is super vague. I don't know exactly what that means. Where the other three I can identify clearly. And then the last one, the detractors. Is there any personal input when you ask that question? Is there a why that they could type in or say, or I guess these are phone calls, so that they can tell you why that this 44% is a detractor for us? Because that would be perfect timing to find out. Why would you say that, right?
Right. And something we have to balance while we do these calls is making sure that they're short enough so that we have we don't overtake people's time. So we didn't ask a follow-up to this in this particular survey, but any of these findings could be things that you can look into a bit further. For example, with just focus groups or one-on-ones with citizens, just identifying that there is potentially more detractors than promoters. Is sort of the first step in being able to look into the issue. So there wasn't a follow-up in this particular survey, but something to look into.
Yeah, if possible in the future, because I would think that would, as far as the timing, if you're going to make a statement such as that, then there's obviously a reason. So I would like to, that would be one point where I'd like to see some personal input of the interviews. But thank you.
Hey, I got City Manager Bob Nicolay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thought I would just clarify a couple of numbers because they've come up a couple of times and they are important. First of all, the sampling was done using landlines and cell phones, so it was a mixture of both, not just landlines. Secondly, to get to perhaps a different response to your question, Councillor Bosch, this sample size yielded a margin of error plus or minus 4.9% within a 95% confidence interval. So the statistical validity of the sample size is ascertained mathematically, and this would be considered to be a high confidence interval. And the last one, back to Mike's question, we had a 8.7% response rate on 401 interviews. So a simple extrapolation for them would be just over 4,600 calls were made, yielding a 8.6% or 8.7% response rate.
Thank you very much for your comments. Councillor O'Connor.
Thank you, Chair O'Toole. Mr. Webb, I'm just curious on this detractor thing. And in my world, 5 is on the, it's barely a pass, but you've included the 6s in the detractors. And I'm just saying, to me, that's a pass. It's not a high pass, but it is a pass. So I'm just curious as to why that's weighted, because that would certainly change the numbers at the end of the day. And saying, hey, you're somewhat satisfied or whatever. Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, and it's a great point. The way that we structured this this metric was to align with previous years of surveys. We at Deloitte, we typically do it on a different scale, and I would agree 6 is. I would probably include that in the neutral. There is different ways that you can make the scale. It could be an argument could be made that sort of 7 or 8. That's like in education systems, 70 or 80 is like sort of an average or something you're shooting for. So 6 might be slightly on the negative side. Typically, we would probably put 6 or 7 sort of as the neutral, and like 8 to 10 as potentially positive. So there's a few ways that you can look at this metric. We just wanted to align with the previous years.
Thank you. Not necessarily that the last time was any better, and we could improve it by saying, you know what, if you give us a 5, you're the neutral, and a 6 is more positive. But anyway, that's just my take on it. But thank you very much. Excellent survey.
I'll just check around the table here. I don't see anybody else wanting to. Oh, now the hands go up. Councillor Bosch.
Thank you, Chair O'Toole. I know these surveys are fairly fluid, and every 2 years is a good indication, but with things that we're going through potentially coming out of COVID, would you say healthcare and cost of living now would be top priority as far as an overall picture and your surveys that you're doing now? Would those concerns be higher on the list than what we have?
I do think, based on the surveys that we've run across the country, you do see healthcare and cost of living coming up sort of across the board. I wouldn't necessarily say that's. I mean, it is location specific. Certain areas have harder access to healthcare, but it is sort of across the board. So cost of living, it's one of those things that that people are concerned about really all across the country, and potentially something to include in future surveys if we want to keep monitoring that over time. But definitely, I would say those issues are coming up all across the country. We do business surveys as well and workforce surveys, and those are definitely key issues everywhere.
Right. I think to some degree we have to take these surveys with a grain of salt, although they're excellent surveys. Our trends or our things in our lives change very quickly, it seems, and healthcare and cost of living is certainly on the forefront, in my opinion.
All right.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
And I think just even among the services that we've asked, just being able to sort of rate and prioritize those is very helpful. Even if there is other service areas that could be included and that we might include in future areas, I still think being able to prioritize and sort of pick which ones might have the most improvement to your community satisfaction is quite helpful for you. So hopefully that it helps you in prioritizing some of the service areas.
Right. Everybody's been around the table once with questions. We're running a little bit behind in our meeting. So thank you very much, Simon, for your comments and explanation of the report. I just want to comment that it was good to see that the Grande Prairie residents feel very positive about the state of the local economy. And the city's customer service continues to be highly ranked. And the new survey this year, we asked residents on their views of city events, and 93% responded in a very positive manner. And that was taken in June and July, and we still got 6 months left. So I'm sure that's going to be great numbers at the end of the year. So thank you for your report, and we'll move on.
Councillor Toole, did you want a motion?
Yep, we will make a motion. I'm looking for Councillor Bressie to make a motion.
I would make some. Okay.
Okay, sorry.
Great. Yeah, I would move that we receive this for information, and just I do want to give a big shout out to City Manager Nicolay and our directors. Council's put a lot of effort over the last couple of years into economic development and public safety. I'd argue those have been the number 1 and 2 priorities of both this council and the last council. We've also spent a lot of money in roads, and I think this shows that our residents are seeing good results from that and are praising that. And I think that does involve every department. You look at community safety, and it's got obvious. Our roads and our protective services are obvious for that, but somebody going to a community center, going to a good community event, and having better community connection, I think that contributes to safety. I look at it's been hard financially to find money for these programs, and our corporate services have been huge for that. I really do think every department has to do with those two things, and our residents are seeing the results of good work. So excited to move that we receive this for information.
Okay, call for a vote. Please vote.
Councillor Blackmore is in favor.
Mayor Clayton in favor.
Thank you.
Councillor Bressie in favor.
Perfect. Thank you. It's unanimous. And I want to apologize, Councillor Blackmore, but Dylan stole the microphone before you got a chance to get in. So.
Okay, no worries.
I was all lined up to give it to you. Okay. We'll move on. Thank you very much. We'll move on to item 3.3, Policy 100, and Council Remuneration. And Ms. Whiteway.
Thank you, Chair O'Toole. So I'll respectfully assume you've all read and reviewed the report and policy amendments. And I'll just do a brief summary. So the current policy 100 sets the remuneration rates and expense reimbursement rates for this council's term. So since this policy was approved in August of 2020, changes have occurred that caused the policy to no longer support current and up-to-date information. So specifically, the amendments address the fixed rate for mileage reimbursement for the use of a personal vehicle and updates to the mandatory event schedule, to replace AUMA with Alberta municipalities, and to identify specific events pertaining to Alberta municipalities, FCM, and RMA that take place annually. So administration is proposing amendments to update Policy 100 to support recent changes and recommend that Council approve the amended policy at the next City Council meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Ms. Blackmore, would you be interested in making a motion?
I would move that the motion, as I don't have it in front of me because my e-scribe doesn't work, but I would make the motion to send this forward to Council. I do have one question of Ms. Whiteway first, though. And the question is, what is the current government rate for mileage? Is it still 53 cents a kilometer, or has it gone up?
Thank you, through the chair. So currently it is at 61 cents a kilometer.
Okay, thank you. And I would go forward with the motion.
Okay. Councillor Bressie?
Great, thank you, Chair O'Toole. I just suggest one small amendment in case Councillor Blackmore would be open to it as a friendly. But looking at the scheduled mandatory events on number 2, talked about the Alberta municipalities events. I think a President's Summit is likely to replace Municipal Leaders Caucus next year, so I'd suggest adding in President's Summit onto that line. President's Summit.
I got the note of approval.
I'm certainly
here.
fine with that. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Okay,
Yep. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. So call for the vote.
Councillor Blackmore is in favor.
Mayor Clayton in favor.
And that passes unanimously. Thank you. So we'll move on to, there's no correspondence, no other business, no bylaw policy review, but we do have an outstanding items list. And I know, but I gotta say it, we have nothing on there. Okay. With that, there's no motion for nothing to be done. So I call this meeting adjourned. Thank you. Give us a 5-minute break and we'll get the